I really didn't want to get married, but I was under so much pressure, you know, being a young actress, being young, and I was just like pregnant. And I was just like, I didn't know what to do. But I just knew, I was like, I never wanted to be married.
She was 26 years old, 3 months pregnant, walking down the aisle in a Bagley Mishka silk velvet gown that cost more than most people's cars. And she was sobbing. Not joyful tears, not nervous tears. The kind of crying that happens when you know in your bones you are making the biggest mistake of your life. That was December 31st, 1997. The man waiting for her at the end of that aisle was Will Smith. And he had no idea that the woman about to become his wife had already started writing the ending of their marriage in her head before she ever reached him. 28 years later, at 53, Jada Pinkett Smith finally said it out loud. In her 2023 memoir, Worthy, in her sit-down with Hoda Kotb on NBC, on her own Red Table talk show with Will sitting right next to her on camera. She admitted what Will Smith had spent a quarter-century refusing to let himself fully see. She never wanted to be married. Not on the wedding day, not the year after, not ever. And once you understand that one fact, the slap heard around the world at the Oscars stops being a story about Chris Rock. It becomes the final crack in a man who had been quietly breaking for 25 years. So, let me walk you through it. Because the world got Will Smith wrong. They saw a man who lost control on the biggest night of his career. They saw a man who threw away 30 years of goodwill in 6 seconds. But what they did not see was the quarter-century that came before. The jealousy he could not shake. The wedding day where his bride sobbed all the way down the aisle. The young R&B singer their own son brought into the house. The public humiliation she made him sit through on her own show on camera. And the separation she never told him was permanent until after she had told the rest of the world. What broke Will Smith was not Chris Rock. It was the woman he gave his whole life to. It started back in 1994. Will Smith was the biggest star on television. The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air had turned him into a household name. He was 25 years old, worth millions, and married to his first wife, Sheree Zampino. They had a young son named Trey, but the marriage was already unraveling when Jada Pinkett walked into an audition for the show. She did not get the part. They said she was too short. But Will noticed her, and he waited. He waited until his divorce was finalized in 1995 before he picked up the phone and called her. From that first phone call, he was all in. That was just who Will was. Two young, brilliant, impossibly ambitious people building something together. Will had the charm that made the whole world fall in love with him. Jada had a fire he could not look away from. Magazine covers called them the perfect couple. Hollywood royalty, the real thing. By November 1997, Jada was pregnant. Will proposed in bed. No rooftop, no cameras, no production, just the two of them in a quiet moment. And he was happy. He was building the family he had always wanted. But Jada did not want a wedding. She wanted something small, maybe just the two of them on a mountaintop somewhere. Private, hers. When her mother found out there would be no ceremony, she called Will in tears. And Will, being Will, the man who wanted everyone around him to feel loved, sided with her mother. He thought he was doing the right thing. He thought love meant making the people he cared about happy. So on New Year's Eve 1997 in Baltimore, in front of 100 guests, Jada Pinkett walked down that aisle 3 months pregnant. And she cried the whole way down. Not tears of joy, tears of fury. She has described that day, in her own words, as horrible. She said years later on her own show, with the same certainty she had on day one, that she never wanted to be married. She has said she was so upset about being pressured into the wedding that she could barely stand up straight. Will heard her say all of that out loud, on camera, with millions of people watching. And he kept his face still, the way he had learned to. He probably knew it then. Knew it before the vows were even finished. Knew it the moment he saw her face walking toward him, crying and pretending it was something else. But he stayed. Because Will Smith believed that if he just loved her hard enough, it would eventually be enough. They had Jaden in 1998 and Willow in 2000. Will's career went stratospheric. Men in Black, Ali, The Pursuit of Happiness, 2 Oscar nominations, $20 million a movie. Forbes called him the most bankable star in Hollywood. Together, they built an empire. a 25,000 square foot mansion in Calabasas on 150 acres of land designed from scratch. Construction reportedly took 7 years to finish. The compound had a private gym, a recording studio, a man-made lake, multiple sports courts. At its peak, their combined real estate portfolio was reportedly worth more than $70 million. From the outside, they were untouchable, the couple everybody wanted to be. But inside that mansion, something was rotting, and it had a name Will could never quite say out loud: Tupac Shakur. In his 2021 memoir titled Will, he admitted publicly to what he called a raging jealousy over Jada's connection to Tupac. They had met at the Baltimore School for the Arts as teenagers. Their bond was deep, legendary. By every account, it was one of the defining relationships of Jada's life. Will wrote in his book that he was tortured by it. He said he wanted Jada to look at him the way she had looked at Tupac. He said he had been in the same room as Tupac more than once and could never bring himself to walk over and say a single word. The jealousy was that loud in his head. Tupac was murdered in September 1996, a year before Will and Jada got married, and the ghost of that relationship never left the house. Because here's the cruel math of it. You cannot compete with a living person, but you really cannot compete with a dead one. A living rival can let her down. A dead one stays perfect forever. That ghost lived in the silences between them, in every room of that 25,000 square foot mansion that Will had built with his bare hands and his career and his desperate need to prove that he could give her a life Tupac never could. And none of it mattered, because you cannot outbuild a memory. You cannot out-earn a feeling. You cannot construct a house big enough to fill the space left by someone who died before you ever had the chance to compete. Fast forward to 2016. Will and Jada had been married for nearly 20 years. And according to Jada in her later interviews, they looked each other in the eye one day and made a decision. They would separate in every way except legally. No announcement, no divorce, just two people who would continue showing up as a family while living completely separate lives behind closed doors. Jada has said in her memoir that she had been in a chronic state of discontent for years. She said the picture of the happily married couple just did not match the reality anymore. She told Hoda Kotb on NBC that they had been living separately since 2016, 7 years before the rest of the world found out. And that would have been bad enough on its own. But here's the part that gets you. Will reportedly thought they were still working on things. He thought the separation was a pause, not an ending. She let him believe that. She let the world believe they were still together. And while Will was out there at red carpets with his hand on her back, defending her name in every interview, calling her his wife, Jada had already checked out emotionally years earlier. And then came August Alsina. During that separation, while Will was still wearing his wedding ring and calling her his wife in public, Jada began what she would later describe as a relationship with a 23-year-old R&B singer named August Alsina. Their son Jaden had introduced them. Her own son brought this young man into their family circle, and a relationship began. August was 23 years old at the time, Jada was 45, a 22-year age gap, and their teenage son was the bridge. August later said publicly in a 2020 interview that Will had given his blessing, that the relationship had happened with full knowledge and full permission. Whether all of that is exactly true is something only the three of them really know. But what is undeniable is what happened next. In July 2020, after August went public about the relationship, Jada sat Will down on Red Table Talk, her own show in front of cameras, and made him sit there while she described what had happened to millions of viewers around the world. She called it an entanglement. Not a mistake, not a regret, an entanglement. The internet turned it into a meme within hours. Will Smith, the most beloved man in Hollywood, reduced to a punchline because his wife was sitting across from him on her show, calmly explaining a relationship with a man younger than some of their furniture. His face in that episode told you everything you needed to know. The tight jaw, the hollow eyes, the silence of a man who had spent 23 years absorbing hits and had just taken the biggest one yet on live television, on her show, on her terms. And it did not stop there. 3 years later, in October 2023, while promoting her memoir Worthy, Jada revealed publicly for the first time that the 2016 separation had happened at all. She said she finally felt free. She was doing press tours, morning shows, podcasts, smiling, laughing, telling the world about the marriage she had escaped while the man she had escaped from was still trying to rebuild the career she had a hand in destroying. That memoir reportedly sold more than 21,000 copies in its first week and debuted at number 3 on the New York Times bestseller list. She was profiting from the wreckage. Every chapter, every interview, every new revelation was another piece of their private life sold to the public, and Will was the one paying the real price because the slap had already taken everything from him. He knew before she wrote the book. He knew before she went on her press tour smiling about freedom. He knew that every word she published was another nail in a coffin he was still lying inside. And the worst part is, he could not say a word. Because defending himself meant attacking the mother of his children. And Will Smith, whatever else you think about him, was never going to do that. So, on March 27th, 2022, Chris Rock walked onto the Oscar stage and made a joke about Jada's shaved head, a result of the alopecia she had been living with publicly and painfully for years. And something inside Will Smith, something that had been held together with duct tape and willpower for a quarter century, finally gave way. He walked onto that stage, he slapped Chris Rock in front of the entire world. He sat back down, and he screamed from his seat, "Keep my wife's name out of your mouth." My wife? He said wife? He had not been living with her as a wife in any real sense for 6 years. They had been separated since 2016. But in that one moment, on the biggest night of his career, the night he was about to win his first Academy Award for King Richard, he reached for the only word that still meant something to him, even though that word had stopped meaning something to her years ago. The consequences came fast and they came hard. The Academy banned Will Smith from the Oscars for 10 years. He resigned before they could expel him. Netflix shelved a project called Fast and Loose that he had been attached to. His Q score, the industry measure of likability, reportedly collapsed from 39 to 24 almost overnight. Industry estimates put his lost earnings somewhere between $50 and $100 million in the months that followed. Studios that had been lining up to work with him went silent. For nearly 2 years, he was radioactive. And while the world debated whether he deserved forgiveness, Will was alone. Not performing for cameras, not spinning narratives on talk shows. Just alone in the wreckage of a career he had spent 30 years building, trying to figure out how a man worth more than $300 million could feel like he had nothing left. They started selling off properties. A 5-bedroom house in Maryland reportedly sold for $817,000. A home in Woodland Hills, originally purchased for around $910,000, was listed for $2 million. The 150-acre Calabasas compound they had built together, once reportedly valued at $42 million, sat on those rolling California hills like a monument to everything that had collapsed. 150 acres of proof that you can build the biggest house in Hollywood and still not have a home. But here's where this story takes a turn that the headlines never gave you. Will Smith did not disappear. He did not spiral. He did not go on a revenge tour. He went quiet. And then slowly, he rebuilt. In June 2024, Bad Boys' Ride or Die opened to $56 million domestically and grossed more than $400 million worldwide on a $100 million budget. The audience Hollywood thought had abandoned him had simply been waiting for him to come back. They had never left. In March 2025, he released his first solo album in 20 years, called Based on a True Story. 14 tracks about pain, faith, reflection, and rebuilding. He called it the first in a trilogy. The reviews were mixed. The charts did not move much. But that was not the point. The point was that Will Smith chose to process his pain through music, not through a tell-all memoir designed to humiliate the woman he had once loved. And that is the difference that tells you everything about these two people. By September 2025, Paramount had signed Will to a major multi-picture deal. I Am Legend 2, with Michael B. Jordan, Sugar Bandits, Rabbit Hole. Hollywood was not just forgiving him, it was betting on him again. Because whatever happened on that Oscar stage, the audience understood something the tabloids refused to admit. Will Smith was not a villain. He was a man who had been pushed past his limit by 25 years of silence, public humiliation, and a marriage that had been hollowed out from the inside by the very person who had promised to stay. And Jada, she is back on Netflix in the A Different World reboot. She showed up with Will at Paris Fashion Week in 2026 to support their son Jaden's collaboration with Christian Louboutin. Still legally married, still not divorced, still circling each other the way two people do when they have built children and an empire, and decades of shared memory that neither one of them is quite ready to dismantle. But Will never wrote the tell-all. He never went on a talk show to describe her failures on camera. He never dragged her name through the press. He absorbed every meme, every headline, every late-night joke, and he came back with a movie that earned $400 million and an album that said everything he needed to say without ever once mentioning her name. She wrote a memoir monetizing their pain. He wrote music processing his. She told the world she felt free. He showed the world what freedom actually looks like by earning it back one project at a time without destroying anybody else in the process. If you have ever watched somebody you loved rewrite the story of your relationship for profit, if you have ever stayed quiet while somebody else got the applause for walking away from something you had spent decades trying to hold together, then you already understand why Will Smith snapped. And you already understand why it was never really about Chris Rock. 25 years, 2 children, more than $300 million, and a slap heard around the world. Will Smith did not just survive the most public humiliation in modern Hollywood, he walked through it, he rebuilt on the other side, and he let his work say what his words never would. So what do you think? Did Will Smith deserve better than what he got? Or was this story always going to end exactly the way it did? Drop your take in the comments. And if this one hit you the way it hit me, make sure you are subscribed because we have another story coming this week that you are not going to want to miss. She wrote a book about their marriage. He wrote an album about himself, and only one of them had the decency not to use the other one's name.